when it works.
Cool.
Okay, we are live. It works.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February 17th, 2021 Finance Committee meeting. We will call the meeting to order. Jenny, will you call the roll?
Mr. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Keeler?
Here.
Ms. Saludo?
I'm here. Thank you. First item on our agenda is to take a look at the minutes from our December 2nd, 2020 meeting. Does anybody have any edits to the draft of the minutes?
No.
Excellent. Hearing none, I'll take a motion to approve.
So moved.
And a second? Jenny?
Ms. Saludo?
Yes.
Mr. Keeler?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Awesome. All right. So I think it's time for me to hand it over to Matt. Yes?
Yes, thank you. Council members, we have a couple items on the agenda to discuss tonight. We're going to be talking about the Stormwater Grant Pilot Program, commercial leases, reviewing the operating budget, and some discussion of the Capital Improvements Fund, the Parkland Acquisition Fund, a relationship of the revenues regarding those two funds, and then we'll finish up with a discussion of the future 2021 schedule. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Kirby, who will be presenting on the stormwater program.
Good evening, members of council. My name is Kirby Dirth. I'm an intern in the office of the city manager. And I'm going to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight about and give you a brief overview of how the stormwater topic has progressed through the Community Services Advisory Commission and City Council, and have Nick provide an overview of the options presented to CSAC and their rationale for their recommendation. To start, Dublin City Council requested CSAC review the city's past and current practices regarding the maintenance of stormwater management basins in residential areas. At the September 10th, 2019 CSAC meeting, staff presented an overview of the City of Dublin's stormwater master plan and an inventory of stormwater management assets throughout the community. The Dublin Geographic Information System identified 305 stormwater basins within the city. Of the 305 basins, 154 are located on property owned by the City of Dublin, and staff then identified 46 of which are on City of Dublin property, but are privately maintained by the homeowners association within the neighborhood in which the basin serves. CSAC requested further information, which was presented at the November 12th CSAC meeting. In February, after careful consideration, the commission recommended to Dublin City Council that the city assume the maintenance of the 46 stormwater basins located on city property, with the consideration that there would be some sort of funding mechanism identified to account for the increase in stormwater maintenance. City Council conducted a substantial discussion around the recommendation brought forward and ultimately chose to refer the topic back to the commission with the goal of identifying a funding mechanism or a programmatic model. Staff returned in August of 2020 with several proven funding mechanisms and programs to present to the commission. Staff utilized Environmental Protection Agency's municipal stormwater guidelines to illustrate what best practices are used to fund stormwater programs. Staff also highlighted several examples of municipalities leveraging EPA best practices and an example of an innovative programmatic model. Following careful deliberation, the commission recommended council establish a grant pilot program to efficiently and effectively gauge the needs of the community. Council then referred this issue to the Finance Committee for further budget and programmatic considerations. So the commission reviewed the pros and cons of a number of options for moving forward, including assuming maintenance with no new dedicated funding stream. Maintenance activities would be supported by the CIP and the general fund. Some pros associated with this is that the sources of general revenue and capital improvement funds are generally understood and accepted by residents and business interests, and they're also generally stable from year to year. Some of the cons associated with this option are that stormwater management has historically struggled to compete against other needs. Major allocations of general fund revenues for stormwater system enhancements are rare, and the sources of general revenues really have little inherent association with the origin of stormwater management needs in the community. The commission also reviewed the pros and cons of a number of new dedicated funding streams that the city could adopt when assuming maintenance. The first of which was a special improvement district. The assessment improving funding model appropriates costs to the properties that directly require assistance or maintenance. Some of the pros associated with that is that special improvement districts are capable of generating sufficient funding for routine maintenance if fees and taxes are established at an adequate level. Funding sources directly benefit, those funding sources directly benefit from service provision. Some of the cons with the special improvement district include that they require owners and property owners in the district to sign a petition to create one. Also, if current neighborhood organizations are unable to generate sufficient revenue for all of their stormwater related costs, special improvement districts are likely to achieve the same outcome without raising fees higher than they currently are. And also government would have to pay prevailing wage, which would further elevate those fees. Another option that CSAC reviewed were development fees or impact fees. These costs are applied to developers to fund publicly owned and operated off-site stormwater services. This ultimately relieves the taxpayer and utility ratepayers, and they support the regulatory function of government. However, special fees typically provide only a small amount of revenue in communities in which are already developed. If a community is already developed, there's not sufficient revenue to generate. Lastly, the commission reviewed the idea of a stormwater utility. Stormwater utility fees are generally calculated based on the amount of impervious area on a property, resulting in larger commercial properties paying more than smaller residential households. Some of the pros associated with a stormwater utility are that they create a stable, dedicated user fee revenue stream that is capable of covering project costs and assuring long-range scheduling of capital improvement program. User fees may also free up general revenues and other resources allocated to stormwater management for other purposes. However, the cost of implementing a utility user fee is a function of the number of accounts, financial analyst requirements, engineering requirements, the establishing of a billing department, and other information systems related to the project. This creates significant administrative burden, resulting in new spending on support staff. Again, those with large impervious areas, including businesses, hold a higher portion of the financial burden and ultimately will carry this burden. Ultimately, CSAC decided that these proven funding models were not necessarily great fits for the scope of this project. Special improvement districts and development fees would not generate sufficient revenues. And the stormwater utility question is a really big response to larger stormwater system concerns, which are ultimately outside of the scope of these 46 basins. This led CSAC to consider options for projects that would balance the needs of the community with the financial limitations associated with moving forward without a new funding model. The first of which was a phased approach. One pro of this is that the city would be taking costs incrementally over time, allowing for future budgeting and kicking the can down the road, if you will. Some of the cons are that the HOAs are still on the hook for the costs in the short run. Another option would be to establish a grant program. Grant programs are highly customizable. Staff could select certain maintenance activities to qualify. They maintain HOA responsibility, but with public assistance. And there's a little amount of administrative burden and this is lower in cost to the city compared to other options. One of the cons is that ultimately grants may not provide sufficient relief to these HOAs. And lastly, CSAC talked about doing nothing. One of the pros is that we're not taking on any more financial burden and we're not establishing a precedent. However, they did acknowledge that if we did nothing, problems will persist and the stormwater system may degrade at large due to a lack of maintenance. The commission ultimately decided to recommend that the city establish a grant program similar to the Bowling Green, Kentucky's proven model that was brought to them in prior meetings. The rationale included the fact that a grant program can be tailored to the needs of the community while adhering to budgetary limitations associated with adding additional maintenance responsibilities without a new revenue stream. City staff and council can limit qualifying maintenance activities to specific maintenance projects, allowing for the strategic apportionment of support. By establishing a merit-based grant program, the city can provide the assistance HOAs require when expensive, inconsistent expenses arise by application. The application review process will also provide the city a greater understanding of the stormwater needs of these 46 basins and what the challenges they face are. And lastly, the city can require matching grants, assistant caps, and minimum project costs to ensure that both parties have skin in the game. And now I'm going to pass it over to Nick to talk about CSAC's recommendation.
Good evening, members of council. Just really quickly wanted to remind you all sort of what the commission's ultimate recommendation was to council back a few months ago. As Kirby stated, they did recommend establishing a pilot grant program, but they did find it also important to recognize stormwater utilities sort of as a long-term stormwater management strategy for sort of the long-term considerations and a funding solution long-term for the city to consider. Kirby, thanks. So to finish up here with this presentation, and then we'll allow some time for discussion and answer any questions you all have, is to just walk through a few of the components and the high-level components of the framework that we advanced to this committee last week. So we would look for the length to be around 2 calendar years. Certainly we could discuss that time frame, but we think that would be at an appropriate time to sort of assess what the need and the usefulness of this program might be for the community. The funding, we put around $30,000 annually from the capital improvement program. Kirby had mentioned the Bowling Green, Kentucky program that we had brought forward to the commission back in 2020. This is a similar allocated amount to what they had, what they were using as well, and we found it to be an appropriate dollar amount. The eligibility, again, would be these publicly owned, privately maintained stormwater basins that exist within the city of Dublin boundaries. I didn't list it out here on the slide, but project qualifications would have to meet at least one threshold that has been established by our engineering department. Those were laid out within the framework that was advanced to this committee. And then as far as a prioritization of what projects would be accepted, what projects aren't accepted over each other, there would be a decision criteria that would be leveraged by our engineering department that would be overseeing the applications that come into the city. And they would use almost a scorecard, so to speak, which was a part of that framework as well. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on before we have some discussion and answer any questions that you all might have is just some of the components of the grant requirement itself. We thought it was important to have a minimum contribution for the HOAs as far as the projects that would be brought forward as a part of this program. We put that minimum at $2,000, but again, we could have some discussion around that component. And then ultimately, we thought it was important to make sure that there was an up to 50% match of the eligible cost for a project, and that no project would exceed $6,000 from the city. So ultimately, if you're thinking about the number of projects that could be allocated within a given program year, you'd probably see, anywhere between maybe 5 to 15 if you're looking at those dollars and backing into the $30,000 amount. And so, Kirby, if you want to go ahead and unshare the presentation for the time being, and we can certainly bring it up if they have specific questions about anything there. But we have myself and Kirby who spent a lot of time working with the commission through a lot of these recommendations, and then we also have Paul Hammersmith and Matt Stifler here who at various times were there working with the commission as well to answer any questions that you all might have around it.
So Christine, I'm raising my hand, but you can't see me.
I can't see you. Go ahead, Greg.
A couple of quick questions. Oh, so we're really just focusing on these 46 ponds.
Yep.
Of those 46 ponds, are all 46 currently, is the maintenance currently an HOA responsibility?
Yes.
And of those 46 that are currently an HOA responsibility, do we know how many of them have sought assistance in the past? And are we going to be maybe waking some problems that were asleep and they didn't even know to ask? And now if we put this program out there, all 46 are going to start asking. Or do most of them already seek assistance?
I mean, that's an interesting question. And we've talked about the staff level. When we first started this conversation with CSAC back in 2019. And the answer is we really haven't been overwhelmed with responses. I mean, maybe one that we could identify, possibly two. And some of those actually related to maintaining the open space where those basins were located, not necessarily the basin itself. So, kind of the basins got mixed into that request of, well, we'd like the city to assist us in maintaining this city-owned reserve area, not just necessarily the basin. So, I mean,
so we could be encouraging a much, much bigger problem and a much longer line of people asking for assistance by having this program than what has been created by the people that have asked in the past.
That's possible.
And then help me, if you will, Paul, help me understand as far as managing storm water. And I would imagine there's not one answer for all 46, but generally speaking, are the stormwater retention basins managing the stormwater that's associated with the development that is that neighborhood? Or are they managing the bigger flow of rainwater throughout our community that's changed by different developments and different things? Like for example, if a shopping center goes, if the Giant Eagle, for example, that may change the stormwater management situation for a nearby neighborhood. Are these, as a stormwater management device, are they managing the situation created by that neighborhood? Or are they managing a bigger problem of dealing with stormwater in the community as a whole?
Almost exclusively, these would be managing stormwater within that neighborhood. We only have a handful of what would be termed regional stormwater basins in the city, which is somewhat unfortunate that, that's why we've ended up with so many basins, the 305 basins that Kirby mentioned. Is because they are individual to neighborhoods. And that's just a product of how the neighborhoods developed, phase by phase, area by area. But no, to answer your question, almost exclusively, that basin serves that neighborhood.
And please don't take my questions as not encouraging or appreciating all the work that you guys have put into trying. I mean, you didn't put this problem on your plate. Other people put this problem on your plate, and you were left to deal with it. And now you attempted to come up with a solution. My concern about this is these ponds are very aesthetically pleasing. They're nice to drive by. They really benefit. So if they're managing the stormwater for each individual neighborhood that they are in, they are an aesthetic feature for those people that live there. They're the ones that get to enjoy it. They get to walk around it. They get to go fish in it. It's an amenity, if you will, for that neighborhood in many ways, although an expensive one and certainly difficult to maintain. It is an amenity and a benefit and a feature that is sort of isolated to that neighborhood. And so if I'm thinking about, a neighborhood down in Heather Glen, who's now going to be spending some of the city's resources to maintain a pond over by Wellington, I'm going to kind of wonder why is the general good kicking in to take care of an amenity for a specific neighborhood when it is currently that specific HOA's responsibility? Why are we as a community helping to lift that lift? And I think that's a legitimate question. And also my bigger concern is that if we have heard from, let's just say on the high end, 10 of these 46 HOAs that have requested some kind of financial relief, and we start a program, it just puts me in mind a lot of the neighborhood beautification grant process that we have, especially when you get to the matching thing and all that. It just feels a lot like that program. And once you advertise that, and once, and they are expensive features. So if you're a neighborhood that's paying a lot for this maintenance and you see that some other neighborhood just got grant money from the city to care for it, I imagine we are encouraging people to now ask for assistance. We have a program in place. If we've had 10 out of 46 asked in the past, I imagine probably half of them would begin to ask. And now, how do we divide up a scarce resource by even a lot more people? I mean, how do we define, if the real issue is expense, that they are expensive to maintain, how do we pick one neighborhood over the other? And I mean, we are maybe just we have an uncomfortable conversation probably once every 2 or 3 months when it comes up now. We may be creating an enormous headache for ourselves where it's very difficult for whoever it is that would make the decision, who's the have and who's the have not, who is first in line, who is the most worthy, who's the most, and I just think that we're really setting ourselves up to create a bigger problem than what we currently have. Although I greatly appreciate and we got staff here up front, the people that charged you with this task aren't here helping talk this through. You guys are here trying to figure it out. So I really, really appreciate that. Our Dublin staff always, they never say no. They say, well, we'll figure it out. And I know that's what you're doing. My concern is when it's a feature that's strictly related to a neighborhood, they knew going into it that this was an amenity they were going to be responsible for. I get all that. How do you spread the burden community-wide? And are we going to encourage where many, many more of these 46 to come get in line for this money? And the money is going to run out awfully, awfully quick. And after 2 years, then what do you do? Because once you start funding this, I don't know how, once you would give a grant, how do you then reverse that grant, 3 years? I mean, this is an ongoing issue. Every year, these expenses are being incurred. And if we try to come up with some funding for this year and next year to help lift or, help carry that burden, what happens 3 years from now? And do we stop? And I know with the beautification grants, you cannot get another grant 2 years in a row unless there's money left over and all the grants have been awarded and you're still there with a worthy project, then you can get it. Do we do something like that? And what happens if we give $6,000 to some particular neighborhood this year and then people move in and the burden is less? I guarantee you they will all be back the year after that saying, what in the world? I just moved in and I only had to pay this much, and now it just went up triple because the city's grant isn't available anymore. How do we deal with those kinds of circumstances? That's all. Thank you, Christina.
Thanks, Greg. So, Paul, remind me of a couple of things, just so that we can make sure we're all sort of starting from a level set. So these 46 basins were part of the overall neighborhood plan as the developer came to planning and zoning, and because they're required to set aside a specific amount of green space, right? That's a percentage of however big that development's going to be, right? These were put in as part of satisfying that requirement. Is that right?
Probably not necessarily the green space requirements or open space requirement. They were put in to meet Chapter 53 of our codified ordinances, which deal with stormwater management. So first and foremost, these basins, although as Mr. Peterson indicated, are aesthetic features, their primary function, first and foremost, is stormwater management.
Understood. Now, are they allowed to sort of double dip like that, if you will, and include that as part of that green space requirement as well?
Yeah, I mean, they can be located in these reserve areas and then they get credit for the, the acreage of open space, to meet that required open space for that development.
Gotcha. So, now we also have basins that are city owned and city maintained in neighborhoods too, as well, right?
Correct.
Okay, so that's, I think, where some of the problem lies, Greg, to answer your question, is that these were put in as really a requirement of the neighborhood, right? So that's imposed by the city. And the city does maintain some that are owned by the city, but not others. And I think that there's a bit of some perception of how that's not fair either. Now, that being said, the developer who developed these came and said, hey, as part of this, we're going to do this, and then we'll maintain it. Don't worry about it. And I think some of the push-pull we've had over time is the HOAs tend not to take quite as good care of them as the city does. So it's a struggle from that perspective. I hear what you're saying, Greg. I don't disagree with you at all. I do think that, when you provide a grant program such as this one, you're gonna open a can of ideas. But I would argue that this problem starts way back further in the planning and zoning process when we say you're going to have this HOA and we do not require them to bring forward a pro forma for how they're going to afford to maintain their HOA in a fiscally responsible manner, right? When you have an HOA of 40 houses and they're trying to maintain a pond with whether it's a bubbler or whether it's a fountain, as well as the two, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
How are you I don't even know how you make those numbers work. And we don't require that as part of that planning and zoning process way earlier on. So from my perspective, we need to change that process too. And I would push, I've been saying that one for a lot of years and, at this point. So I think, Greg, the struggle comes in that we do have ponds, basins that are city owned and are city maintained for specific neighborhoods. And those are amenities in those specific neighborhoods. So the problem lies in, we have these ponds, which are city owned, but HOA maintained. And so that starts to feel unfair from an HOA standpoint. Then again, they did enter into their agreement with us, knowing that they were going to have to maintain this pond. So that's how I might respond to that one. I don't know that I would advocate for, paying for all of this ourselves, but and maybe a grant program is a good way to try to do it. I do think that I think additional HOAs will come forward and say, oh wait, so I can get $6,000 every whatever years to maintain this pond and I can keep our HOA fees. But if they don't get it, you're right, the HOA fees are going to be higher. I don't know, Andy, I'd really like to hear your thoughts as well.
So you both make very good points. I guess the first question I would ask Paul is, what is the health, the ecological health of those 46 ponds? You have some sort of measurement scale. This is 10 being best and 1 being needs attention. These many storage basins need, stormwater basins need attention and so on.
We just actually went through with a consultant inspecting some of our stormwater management systems in neighborhoods, and then we didn't inspect them all, but kind of a select group of them, and actually the results were pretty good. It's not overwhelming maintenance that basins need. They just need some tender loving care, like vegetation management, the outlet control structures to be maintained, possibly cleared. Some need repaired because of deterioration. So for the most part, we're in pretty good shape. We've got a couple out there that are a little worse than others, but we don't have anything that's really in dire circumstances that we have had to put people on notice that, look, you need to get this fixed in the next 30 or 60 days because it's a huge problem. And in terms of water quality, I think generally speaking, our water quality is pretty good. Especially, that's a function of a wet basin, and partly because one, aeration, being fountains. Number 2 is really just the water turning over. With the storm or the rainfall we've had the last several years, we get a lot of turnover, a lot of water going through the basin, which helps its overall health. of that basin itself.
So, hearing all these, all this input, to Christina's point, you've got a good number of neighborhoods that have stormwater basins that are maintained by the city. You know, for whatever reason, at whatever time, that's the way that deal was arranged. And now you have 46 basins that are the responsibility of the HOA. It would seem to me that a grant program is a way to sort of meet in the middle. And staff is working on a framework to develop criteria so that you have to qualify in order to get the money. Is $6,000 a 50% match up to $6,000? Is that the right number? I don't know. Maybe it should be 5 or 4. But it would seem to me that this is a great starting point. It's a way to help these 46 neighborhoods or 46 retention basins out. And as long as the criteria are such that it's not opening the door to everyone, and it's not, this is not primarily for aesthetic purposes, as Paul laid out. Both Christina and Greg said it's an aesthetic benefit to the neighborhood. And I think a lot of residents probably believe that that's what the reason is. They probably think that it's just to make the neighborhood look pretty, when there's a utilitarian purpose behind it. And that's really the main purpose. But I believe it's worth further discussion and evaluating the criteria that you believe should be put in the grant request.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Andy. I think it's worth taking a look, having staff take a look at refining the potential grant program a little bit, and maybe putting in some stipulations about how often one can apply unless there's additional funds available, because that has worked pretty well with the Beautify Your Neighborhood grant program. When there isn't enough applicants to take up all those funds, you'll allow an applicant to come back a second year. And they have to submit plans. They have to have some skin in the game, if you will. And I think overall it works pretty well. And I'd be interested to for us to take a look at a couple of the provisions in this draft pilot and take a look at them and see what we could potentially do and visit the numbers and make sure that they seem like the right numbers. And I think there's 2 other pieces that need to be followed up on, because while we don't have a ton more developable space for neighborhoods, there's a little bit more, and whether we get another 4 neighborhoods or another 2 neighborhoods or another 10 neighborhoods, this will come up again as part of the whole planning and zoning process. And we will have this discussion again when it comes before council. So I think this is probably a larger discussion for a council work session to determine what is council's policy moving forward on this. And I do think that it's a discussion matter for planning and zoning to determine when is the right time to require some kind of HOA financial pro forma, so that they can even determine before the darn thing is built, are they going to be, fiscally stable with the different types of issues they're going to face. One question I forgot to ask, Paul, with this, because you said that a lot of the requests that you get are really more about the surrounding area around the basin. Does this include that area as well?
No, this is basically from the edge of the water inward and strictly the basin itself.
Gotcha. And remind me, how did this come to us in the first place? Like, what was the impetus for this, and why we then gave it over to CSAC?
For me, it dated back again in probably 2018, 2019 that someone had made this request again, and HOA had. I think Michelle Crandall at the time fielded that request. And so I believe that's how it came forward. I wish I could tell you specifically who made that request, but I don't know with her departure. But because it had come up previously, we felt like, hey, it's worth a discussion. And partly because of the planning and zoning process. of the difference that we've made in our practice, whereby, and council members, you saw our Shire Farms in front of City Council just recently, where with the basins located in that proposed new development, that the city, again, is proposing that we, the city, will maintain those basins. And that's been our current practice, that in city-owned reserves, we now will take upon ourselves to maintain those basins.
Yeah, I think if that is our direction moving forward, and that's what council wants to do, I think that the finite number of these 46, and there shouldn't be more after that if that's the case, I think lends itself to a grant program, especially a pilot grant program, fairly well, because it's not going to be a changing number.
And I think you just raised a good point. I was going to ask Kirby to speak to kind of the pilot nature of this, because I think that'll address your concerns, Greg, about this being perpetual, because we wanted to give for us, it's an opportunity to gather some information. So Kirby, if you want to speak to that.
Absolutely. No, I think the intention is to gauge the need within the community, specifically in speaking to Bowling Green about their program and their experience. They have a lot of initial interest, and then it tapered off over time. And over the last couple of years, they've only had a few applicants trickle in. But I think that within the pilot period, in talking to Nick, it was absolutely our intention to adjust on the fly and as we go, and to make sure that the criteria is such that repeat offenders don't come in, and that there are specific maintenance projects that we would target through our criteria that we would be able to support.
Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on what Nick just said, what Kirby said and what Nick had said earlier when he was kind of going through the math. If the maximum is $6,000 a year, we could, in theory, fund only 5 per year. But based on what Paul said, the health of these retention basins is actually pretty good. So if you're basing the request on poor health or some sort of dire maintenance issue, you're really limiting the number of potential applicants. And so, at a lower level, the $2,000 level, you could get 15 per year. So in 3 years, you could do every retention basin. But I think what we're going to find, based on Paul, Nick, and Kirby's comments, is that there may be a couple that have dire needs and need $6,000. So if you have 2 of those, there's $12,000 the first year. But the actual utilitarian need going forward is likely to be very low or lower. We have 2 years to figure it out. It's presented as a pilot program. Taking the temperature. So I think it's definitely worth further discussion.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, the communication would need to be very clear and succinct to, the HOAs, the 46 HOAs. Are there really 46 different? No, there's more than one pond per. How many HOAs are we talking about? Do you know?
I don't have that off the top of my head, how many different HOAs, but you're right. There could be 2 basins located within a particular neighborhood that are part of the 46.
So I think we just have to make sure that the communication plan that we would put together would be very clear, that it would be really just a pilot, that this may not continue after. So what are you thinking would be the start date of the pilot? Would you start it like January 1 of next year or June 1 of this year? Or what are your thoughts there?
Kirby?
I'll defer to Nick on this.
Okay.
This is part of the application. He has the document.
I can speak toward that. So I think what we had discussed is the grant period itself would be 2022.
Okay.
We would open the application window in the fall of this year.
Gotcha.
Assuming the timeline of everything made sense and this got advanced to that point. But I think what would be appropriate is opening that window in the fall, giving them the opportunity to apply during that time frame, and then it would come to either, you know, this committee or another committee of council for those applications to be presented and approved probably around, you know, a January, February timeframe of 2022.
I
Gotcha.
think, real quick, Christina, just a couple, and you guys
That's
all.
just gonna call on you because I can't see you, so I can't see your reaction.
All very good points. The only couple of comments I would have is I would just caution to be very careful if financial hardship is something that's taken into consideration. You don't want to set up a circumstance where city council is going to be sitting there trying to decide whose financial hardship is worthy and whose financial hardship is not worthy. So to the extent you can leave that out of it, I think that would be a good thing to do. Perhaps you consider a way to label it other than when I first opened these documents and I saw just stormwater maintenance and that the city is going to, let's just be honest about it, have a grant program that subsidizes the maintenance of these ponds. I think we need to be very careful, and maybe we can categorize it more at something like you guys were just discussing, that there's a specific project that needs to be done, and it's for the health of the community and the health of the water and the health. It's not just routine maintenance, because I would submit if I were an HOA president and we had a pond and we were paying to maintain it and there's a grant program that could subsidize it, I'm going to go apply. I think I have the obligation to just, if it's just to maintain and share the cost. So I think we need to maybe make sure we message it that this is for specific projects, you know, replacing aerators or chemical, whatever that's got, I don't even know what you do to it, but whatever that is, make sure that it's not just routine stuff, but that it's like a problem that really needs to be fixed and that it's cost prohibitive. It can help. I think the way you package that can make it really effective. I don't want a council to be sitting there in the future trying to decide which person's financial worth is better than the other, because that's a horrible situation. That's one of the reasons why we went down the whole sewer and water line situation, because one neighborhood came in. Remember the guy, Christine, who came in with the jar of water that was brown and put it up on the thing, and then we're going to try to decide who should get water and who shouldn't. I mean, it's a horrible place to put yourself, and you just don't want to be in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think we need to have some pretty tight language about what is eligible and maybe even explicitly some things that maybe are not eligible. So I guess what we're trying to say is, and I think it sounds like I can get a head nod from Andy. Greg, you can just chime in if you're cool with this. I think what we'd like to do is to send staff back to work on this just a little bit. Work on some timing language, like, you know, you can only apply every other year unless there's funds available, something like that. You guys can come up with it. Let's double check dollars to make sure that we kind of have the right amount. I don't know what the average, you know, cost of an aerator that breaks is, but I'm sure you guys do know all that because you guys are brilliant. You know, and then around kind of what some of Greg was saying is to make sure that it's pretty explicit what would be included as eligible, and maybe even explicit as to what's not. And then let's take a look at it and we can make a recommendation to council, I think, at that point. Greg, what do you think? Since I can't see.
I'm fine with that. One other thing I thought of that I wanted to mention, and I know that we're trending in the direction of, if a developer gives us the pond, we'll maintain it. I know that's the direction we're going. I don't really see stormwater is based on an issue related to that development. I think the developers have to bear a little bit more of the financial burden here. I don't see it any different than if they went and they found, you know, bedrock that they needed to explode with dynamite and it made it more expensive, or, you know, an EPA problem that they needed to clean up. It's the cost of developing that site. And I think we should maybe be asking that, you know, when they cut down a bunch of trees, we make them to make a deposit into our tree replacement project. You know, maybe we make them write a check and help fund this grant program.
Yeah, Greg, I agree. I think that's been part of my whining about, you know, this whole pro forma bit is, if you got an HOA of 40 houses and you as the developer aren't going to pre-fund, for example, your stormwater maintenance, your ponds basically, you know, how are these homes going to be able to afford it in 10 years when they need repair on something? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, we're not talking about that kind of thing early on enough in the process. I think
You're
you're,
exactly right. And it's the, remember when we talked about all the trees
Yep.
along the main roads, like Avery Muirfield, Indian Woods or Indian, whatever that neighborhood I used to live in, all those trees are dying. And we aren't going to replace those trees. We're helping them with a program where the homeowner can replace the tree, but we're not coming in and saying, all right, look, the city's going to pay for all these trees because that's how it was supposed to look when it was put in. We should keep the developer on that hook. And maybe
I agree.
this grant program is a place where we can require them. If you're going to have a detention pond, you're going to have to put 50 grand into the grant program fund to help fund these things into the future, because you guys are the ones who are selling the product that requires these ponds in the first place.
Well, I think the part of the problem, though, Greg, with requiring developers to put something in is if you're talking about a neighborhood that's already been completely built out and the developer's long gone, you're
I
not gonna
totally
make-
get it. I understand. I'm thinking more about the future than
Yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree with
this
you.
grant program now was, because some of those developers are the same ones that put in the neighborhood private deal.
That's right.
Make them make a donation like we do the tree replacement.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know what you want to do with that, Paul, but you know, I think that's something that's going to require some additional conversation, because that has to become part of the planning and zoning process, right? Because you got to fit it into that process somewhere. Because right now it's not in the right place. It's too far along the process. They don't even have to. When do they even set up an HOA? You know, their financials. I don't think they even set them up until well after the homes have begun being built, right?
Yeah, typically after their approval process, but you're right. I mean, it's during the development of, construction of the development itself.
Yeah,
So it
that's
does
where it
come
needs.
towards the tail end.
Yep, that's
Uh,
where it needs to go way earlier in the process. And I do think that is a discussion that's beyond this group. But I do think that, Paul, that's a discussion that needs to be brought to the right group of people.
Understood.
Because it would get us out of this discussion altogether.
Right. A couple of points with, where Greg was headed. Well, like I said, our current practice is that, the city maintains these basins. So, we most likely aren't going to have additions to the 46. And then the other point is, the developers' contributions, honestly, right now are making sure the basin's well constructed. And that, we take care of that during the plan development process and the review of the basins, the construction plans, and then observing the construction and making sure that they are well constructed. And so we're out there the whole time that they're being built. So that's kind of their piece. I understand your point about them, front loading or providing some funds. So I think we have to do some research on that. But again, we shouldn't have any more of these 46 basins.
Andy?
I'm not sure, Greg can speak to this, but the way I interpreted what Greg was saying is the city shouldn't be maintaining any more basins. So we should be adding to the 46, not freezing the 46. I think the challenge is, and front loading is a great idea, but I would anticipate that 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, we're always going to have this problem. Because these HOAs typically are run by non-financial experts. They're a bunch of volunteers, and they're keeping track of the snow removal and the landscaping, because that's something they're doing, every day, every year. But when it comes to these ancillary things, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind until there's a problem. And I just feel like it's almost impossible to not have residents 20 years from now coming back saying, please help us. This pond is an eyesore, there's algae in it, and our HOA does not have enough money. Please help.
Well, see, but Andy, that's what I'm talking about, though, in terms of if we can require that a developer put together that financial plan way earlier in the planning process, because I can tell you, in the neighborhood that I live in, we budget for that every year.
Oh, sure.
It's budgeted, right? I mean, because that's how the pro forma works. That's how it works. And if you're requiring that these developers think about that way earlier in the game, it just gets built into the process. And so as the homeowners begin to take over that budget and begin to take over the process of thinking about that, it's already listed in there. They don't, you see what I'm saying? Now, will it solve all of the problems? No, but it's going to head a whole bunch of them off at the pass.
What I've encountered situations though where an HOA that was formed 15 years ago and they did everything you're talking about. There have been so many HOA presidents and treasurers over the last 15 years. They've lost a lot of those institutional documents or the institutional memory, and they can't even remember who's supposed to be paying for what. So they come back to the city and they say, we think that all these years the city was supposed to be maintaining area A and area B, and the staff digs through our records and says, no, actually the original development text says this. So anyway, much bigger conversation.
Yeah, that is a much bigger conversation. Anyway, so does staff, do you guys have enough direction?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, cool.
And probably only my final comment is, and we heard you loud and clear, and we'll make sure the grant program addresses this, but it is not intended to fund routine annual maintenance.
Right.
Not at all. These are really meant to be capital needs, specific improvements, large expenditures. That's what we're wanting to help with.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Great discussion. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Kirby and Nick, for all the work that you've done as well. Really, really appreciate your help and your time on this. It really was a great discussion. So Matt, I'm looking at my clock and we spent about 51 minutes on that topic, which is great because I think it really needed to be done, not complaining. But we have, according to my agenda here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more things to go. I think B is probably a relatively short discussion. C might be as well because it's really, you're just giving us a review of the actuals from 2020. Is that right?
Yeah, I think a lot of these are more informational transmissions than discussions. I think the real issues of discussions are probably the last two. I think we'll get through them fairly quickly and have time to do a 2-hour meeting and cover everything and have time for discussion. If it looks like we're not, I'll start to trim some from these middle items.
Perfect.
I'll get us out in 2 hours and get us through this agenda. We don't have time to waste.
Yeah, well, it's no problem. And I mean, because sometimes I think B has to be discussed tonight, right?
Yeah, I'd like to, because it's timely at this point. Yep. If we delay it, it's not particularly timely.
Yeah, let's hop into that one. I don't think that one will take terribly long.
So this is the commercial leases for Subway, and this is really just an update. In the quoted text, there is the recommendation that City Council approved, and that is that the forgiveness would last as long as they remain closed, which was projected through the end of the year, with the reevaluation done at the end of 2020. We didn't have a council meeting that met that timeline. Not much has changed with Subway. Not much has changed with the rec center since December. So Subway is targeting, hopefully resuming operations in April. There has been some lifting of restrictions with regard to recreation, so we should see more programming. I've been in contact with the director of recreation. They're in contact with Subway, giving them foot traffic information, staffing information. There's a good level of communication there, but at this point, we're recommending, both recreation and finance staff are recommending that we continue to suspend or forgive the rent until they resume operations. This is widely viewed as an amenity to the recreation center, more so than as a commercial lease that occupies the recreation center. If Subway didn't operate it, the city would have to operate food service operations, which is not something that we have a particular skill set in. So in many ways, we're interested in being patient and waiting for them to be able to resume operations. So I don't think we need anything from you as far as a recommendation to council goes, but this serves as a check-in, and we'll continue to follow that recommendation that they be suspended as long as they remain closed.
Gotcha. Greg and Andy, you have questions or thoughts?
No, that's the right thing to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you both for that. I appreciate it. Moving on to the 2020 operating budget. I just want to cover this relatively quickly, but I did want to spend some time going through some parts of the operating budget, because I think when we talk about the year end, or when we talk about some of the documents, maybe we don't notice some of the details. So I wanted to first start with kind of the building blocks Christina, I understand you're typing, but do you mind muting?
Gosh, I'm sorry. I thought I hit
It's
it.
okay.
My apologies.
No problem. Thank you. So just to go through the operating budget a little bit, I wanted to start by acknowledging the fundamental unit of a public budget, and that is the fund. As you'll see here, there are 14 funds that comprise the operating budget, and these 14 funds are not accidental. Each of those funds represents a revenue stream that is either legally, according to the ORC, or by council policy, restricted to actions that occur in that fund. So for example, the street maintenance and repair fund is a great example. 92.5% of gasoline tax revenues are distributed to that fund specifically for street maintenance and repair. The highway fund receives the other 7.5%, and those funds are specifically attributed to the maintenance and repair of state highways in Dublin. So the reason that those funds exist is to separate those revenues, and that's kind of a unique feature of government accounting. In private accounting, all of your money goes into a general fund and you allocate it as you see fit. We are restricted in the sense that any revenue that the city receives that is dedicated to a specific legal purpose has to have its own fund. So there are 14 operating funds. They're actually just shy of 80 total funds in the city, which means there are 80 legal restrictions on how we spend our money, and funds help us kind of do that. So within that, the general fund is obviously income tax based. That's the largest revenue source for the general fund. State highway and street maintenance are gas tax. The recreation is charges for services revenue for the recreation program. Same with the outdoor pools. Hotel motel is the 6% lodging tax. The safety fund is actually an interesting one. This is the revenue that is in that fund is composed of two things. One is the dispatch contract with neighboring municipalities, but the primary reason that fund was created is because of the safety property tax revenue that the city receives. There's a voted measure, I think it was back in the 1980s, that elected increased property taxes specifically for safety forces. So that is why we have a safety fund, and the general fund transfers money to the safety fund to pay for our police forces. But the revenue that's earned from that property tax has to be used for police, which is why we have a safety fund. A lot of municipalities will fund their police directly from their general fund because they don't have that property tax levy. The remainder of these funds down through cemetery are a mishmash of small funds related to police. There's a lot of requirements when you seize money, federal law, state law, about how that money has to be utilized. So some of those smaller law enforcement specific funds are dedicated to those revenue streams. And those really are a process, a function of federal law. The cemetery fund is for cemetery operations. And then of course, last year we had to create the COVID-19 relief fund. So that kind of explains why we're organized this way. It's not happenstance, it's by design because of the revenues that support our operations. With regard to the operating budget, we had operating revenues of just over 92 million, which was very near but below our original budget of 92.9 million. You can see that we revised the budget mainly in the Q3 supplemental last year, and we took some revenues down significantly, particularly recreation and hotel motel. We try to be conservative in our budget philosophy, and our revised budget actually reflected that pretty well. What's interesting here is the street maintenance and repair and state highway fund. We budgeted the gas tax last year, as part of the 2020 operating budget in the fall of the prior year when the gas tax went up. And we were well north of our original revenue estimates for the first 3 months of the year. The stay-at-home orders in March and April really tanked that fund, frankly. Revenue dropped by over 60%, largest drop in gas tax revenue ever. But as short-lived as that was, gas tax revenues rebounded back. So actually, we never changed our budget for those funds, and we came in slightly over budget in the street maintenance and repair fund and very near budget in the state highway fund. And that's just a credit, again, to our conservative revenue philosophy. So this is just one instance where you see the conservative philosophy kind of played out, because we had 2 months last year where essentially we got almost no gas tax revenue and we were still able to meet budget. So that's a an indication that our conservative philosophy is always working to help us. Moving on to the expenditures a little bit. There's a lot going on here, but one of the things I wanted to point out specifically, for example, was in the safety fund, because this is the best example of this. You can see that safety fund actual spending was a little over $16 million. If I refer back to my prior slide, safety fund revenues were only $4.6 million. So that is really a reflection of the dedicated safety revenues to the dedicated safety expenditures, and that difference has to be covered, if you will, by less restrictive funds. And the only example of that is the general fund. So the general fund includes large transfers to these other special revenue funds to cover those shortfall in safety, pool, recreation, street maintenance and repair, state highway. And in 2020, we know that it's going to cover the shortage in the hotel motel fund. So that is the fund that covers these differences in expenditures and revenues. As you can see, expenditures were down compared to the original budget. The revised budget is a reflection of encumbrances carried over. The revised budget is always a little larger than the original budget because of the encumbrances that are carried over. And those tend to be in the $5 to $7 million a year range. And that was true in the 2020 budget as well. The $2.2 million that was spent out of Fund 265, that COVID relief fund, makes this chart a little bit difficult to interpret and read, because that 77% is a little misleading. That $2.2 million in COVID relief fund exists because other expenditures were essentially pulled out of the other fund. So there was money that was spent in the general fund and the recreation fund that was then reimbursed by the COVID fund. So those expenditures were transferred from the general fund to the COVID fund, which makes the general fund look like it only spent 77%, when in reality, it probably spent closer to 80 or 82%. So it's difficult to really make a year-over-year apples-to-apples comparison about fund spending because of the way federal grants have to be accounted for. They won't let me put the revenue into the fund that it's reimbursing the expenditure. I have to take the expenditure out of the fund. And that is not how I would prefer to do it, but that is how it has to be done. So, you know, that's just a difficulty of reading these graphs. You could see total expenditures were $78.7 million. Looking at these graphically, you start to see a pretty big kind of gap develop between revenues and expenditures. And that really was a result of the cancellation of things that did not occur in 2020 due to COVID, right? That graph comes in at 77 roughly $1 million. If we had an Irish festival, which we will always have an Irish festival, and you know, every year from 06 to 19, there's a festival in there that's not in 2020. So that makes 2020 $2 million to $3 million less than prior years if you were doing an apples to apples. Travel was suspended. There were, you know, canceling Independence Day is another $400,000, on and on and on. And you start to see that that line really didn't decrease. It would have looked much flatter with 2019 had we done the things that we would have done had we not had COVID. So that decrease is really a representation of things that were unfortunately canceled, not a reduction in services. To put a little bit finer point on this, because the graph gets a little choppy from 2016 on, we've been doing and been very aggressive and successful in using the general fund to purchase capital assets. And that makes the red line a little bit difficult to interpret, because these capital assets are part of our operating expenditures, but they're not necessarily part of our operations. So removing them gives you the blue line, which kind of shows that from 2014 to 2017, we did have this ramp up in expenditures as a city, but we've basically been pretty flat funded from 2017 through 2020 in terms of operating expenditures, absent those capital expenditures. And again, that decrease in 2020 is more a reflection of special event cancellations than a true reduction in operating expenditures. Putting these all together in the general fund, I put 2019 on this slide just for reference, because sometimes it's hard to see what we're talking about and compare it to prior years. looking specifically at the general fund, you can see in local taxes, which is basically income tax revenue in this fund, we were very stable. Intergovernmental revenues actually went up in actuals, but were down compared to original budget. We expected intergovernmental revenues to be down in the general fund, and they were. But again, our conservative budget philosophy kind of limited the damage there. Charges for service revenues, those revenues are associated with engineering, planning, building service permits, those types of revenues, and those were down about 25%. So we did see kind of a decrease in development related activity, at least in terms of fee revenue last year. In terms of fines, licenses, and permits, I think it is, you can see once again, we exceeded our budget, but our budget is very conservative. In 2019, we were over $4 million. We've been over $4 million the last 2 or 3 years. And this year we were at 3.4 roughly $million, exceeding budget, but well below what our expectations would have been at the beginning of the year. Interest, again, a conservative estimate there. The miscellaneous category really reflects the sale of the property that is now the OSU Ambulatory Center that was expected in 2019. It didn't occur in 2019, but you can see that the revenue was budgeted in 2019, which is why that actual to budget is so low. And the sale did occur in 2020. And then the other financing sources is really a result of that advance revenue being repaid from the bond proceeds in 2020. Looking at the expenditures, you can see we had a decrease actually of about $150,000 in personnel services, which is actually kind of understating the true decrease because we had an extra pay period in 2020. So the 3.7% that is an actual pay period is actually makes that decrease more pronounced had we had an equal number of pay periods in those years. You can see across all spending categories, we were down last year, which is what we would expect because we had a concerted effort with COVID to make sure that we were managing our resources well. Putting these together in 2020, as has been previously reported, we had a year-end fund balance of 99.2%. Projecting on the current general fund expenditures and fund balance, we're at about 63.6%. Which is well in advance of our 50% general fund policy. The only point I wanted to mention here is that there are some misleading trends you could infer from this graph that I think are important to counter early. And that would be, you could argue that maybe from 2015 to 2019, the percentage of general fund balance was falling because it appears that it is on this graph. But really, a lot of that is a representation of in 2019, that $49.6 million number is the actual number. It doesn't include the $15.5 million that was transferred out. So really, had we not had to do that advance in order to pre-fund the bonds, that number would have been 60 million, which kind of changes that trend line entirely. So we've had a very stable and growing general fund balance since 2018. As a percentage of revenues or as a percentage of expenditures. The other thing that's important to note on this with regard to expenditures is that every dollar in expenditure increases your fund balance requirements by 50% because of the way the general fund policy works. So that $87 million number includes $6 million in capital, an additional $2 million in recreation, an additional $1.5 million in hotel motel transfers over a traditional year. So almost $9.5 million, which is why it's so substantially different than the prior years, because those three things don't usually happen. That increases your fund balance requirement by about $4.5 million, which just further erodes that percentage when you're looking at it. So that kind of explains that we're in good shape, and we ended 2020 in good shape, and gives you some more information on the 2020 budget. And if there are no questions, I'll keep rolling through.
Andy or Greg, you got questions, or we good to let Matt keep going?
Okay. So I wanted to talk about the Capital Improvements Fund land acquisition rollover. One of my goals, I think, for the 2021 Finance Committee is that I wanted to take some time at each committee meeting to discuss revenue opportunities. One of the things, last April when COVID hit and we didn't know what we didn't know with regard to income taxes was I started to kind of compile a list of alternate revenue sources or revenue sources that could be changed or things that could be done to make up for shortfalls. And I thought it would be good in 2020 to take some time to talk about some of those other levers that we don't typically look to, because we don't typically talk about things that maybe exist beyond income tax, since it's such a large percentage of our revenues. So that naturally led to a discussion of the millage and the distribution of millage between parkland and capital improvements fund. And this kind of falls into that line of inquiry, because property tax millage represents about $4 million in revenues, $3.2 million to the capital improvements fund, and about $850,000 to the parkland fund. That's a significant sum of funding, and it represents an even more significant potential drop if we were to see that in income tax revenue because of the 75-25 split. So that's kind of the environment with which this kind of analysis took place. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that it's difficult to talk about policy when you're in such a unfamiliar and kind of extraordinary time. So I want to just preface that what I'd like to talk about today, or the types of things that I think are worthy of consideration today, are kind of with the understanding that we'll be returning to a more normal time. Obviously, if normal doesn't come to pass, then we'll have to do something else or something extraordinary. But waiting to have a policy discussion until we're back to normal seems like a waste of time. So I just want to preface this that I think this is some great ideas for discussion if and when we're back to normal. We may have a while before we get back to normal, and we may have to take other actions until we get there. But as part of the 21 through 25 CIP, we started to discuss the land acquisition appropriation. And we have historically appropriated about $500,000 for land acquisition, which is a nice sum of money, but not necessarily a significant enough sum to do real land bank type opportunities in the city of Dublin. So as part of the conversation surrounding that $500,000, it was discussed that maybe we should try to identify ways to increase that appropriation. And one of the ways that I think has the most chance of success, if you will, or chance to have a real positive impact, is to carry over the unused funds from year to year. So typically, and 2020 is no exception, we don't spend any of the $500,000 that was appropriated. So that returns to the capital fund balance to be reappropriated into the next CIP. So instead of allowing that money to return to the fund balance, along with numerous other items that will be reappropriated in the Q1 supplemental, I would propose that it's a potential policy idea to reappropriate that $500,000 from 2020 into 2021 and increase that. I guess I have a slide here, from $500,000 to $1 million. And the reason for this is that pure land acquisition has been a successful economic development strategy. Some examples here include the West Innovation District, OSU, the Corners, just to name some that we've done in the last few years. But $500,000 isn't necessarily enough to make those types of acquisitions to make those deals happen. So here's the slide that I was kind of getting to. We could increase those unused funds year over year by that unused amount and slowly build up an appropriation and a land bank, if you will, by about $500,000 annually. So this year, we'd have $1 million. In 22, we'd have $1.5 million potentially if we didn't decide to use any of it. And the idea behind this cost for land acquisition is that it would not be tied to a capital improvement project. All of the CIP road construction that requires the acquisition of easements or additional property, those funds are programmed with those projects. So this isn't what that would be for. This would be for land allocation at council's discretion. It could include any type of land acquisition, really. And that's kind of the idea that was tossed around during the CIP negotiations or discussions. So I'm kind of bringing it forward for further consideration here because I think it's a worthy idea. It will impact, obviously, the CIP, but no more so than anything, using funding for any project impacts the CIP. It won't have a significantly detrimental impact because basically we're saying that every year the fund balance available for reappropriations will be reduced by 500,000. The impact is phased in over time. So the impact on the CIP is phased in a way that, we're not taking significant funds from 21 to increase the allocation of land that would otherwise be used for projects. With that, I'm available for any questions or further explanation on this kind of carryover idea.
So Matt, currently the $500,000 appropriation that we do each year basically goes to waste because we're not using it. We're really using the general fund to do land acquisition.
That's true. Absolutely.
Okay, gotcha. I want to make sure Greg and Andy have a chance to ask some questions. Who wants to go
I think it's a
first?
great idea. I think it's a very good policy and a good idea.
Andy?
Greg, are you saying rolling over is a good idea? Yeah.
It's banking land. You know what? We have so much in reserves and everything else. Cash is most easier for us to maintain than the land that's out there that's becoming more and more difficult to acquire. It's getting less and less available. That is a really good asset for us to have to use for economic development.
I agree.
Yeah, I also agree. I think it's the right direction.
Okay. Well, I will include the appropriation to make this kind of policy happen in the Q1 supplemental, which will be heard. The first hearing will be the first hearing in March. So we can discuss with the council that we've discussed this and include it in that ordinance for the whole council's consideration as to whether this is a policy they want to move forward on or not.
Great. I have one more question for you, Matt. Is this unappropriatable? Is that a word?
Unappropriatable?
Can we unappropriate something out of this fund if we were to have an emergency and need it for something?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, frankly, as far as it not being used in prior years, it is nice to have a $500,000 cushion.
Yeah.
That, if something, we've never had to do it, but if we had to find $500,000 for X that was valued, we could have transferred it out of this to X and had the money available. So it's a nice cushion, but I think it could be better utilized to do some land banking in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the fact that we would be able to unappropriate and reappropriate, that's probably more along the lines of the proper grammar there. I think that makes really good sense. We don't lose control over what we want to do with that money should we need to do something else with it, later on. That's
correct. And if for example, this is our strategy, but you're looking at the next CIP and the fourth year of the CIP is really tight and you don't want to cut, you can reduce that carryover amount to make it work in the fourth year. It's the same as any other item in the CIP. It's fully available at council's discretion.
Yeah, I love the extra flexibility this would provide us.
Okay, excellent. So the other fund that I wanted to talk about as a companion to this is the Parkland Acquisition Fund. I first wanted to just kind of talk about the history of the fund balance, at least the history as so far as its recent history. You can see that from 2017 to 2020, the fund balance basically doubled, and it's expected to increase by another 400,000 to 2.8 million at the end of 2021. I wanted to point out that fund balance did take into account the purchase of the North Riverview properties that council approved in Ordinance 0121. So that's kind of an updated fund balance based on what I know we're going to spend. Talking about the history of the fund, so I wanted to kind of give an indication as to why the fund balance has been growing since 2017 and why that started to be kind of a differentiating point in the fund's life cycle, because historically the fund has not had a significant fund balance, so to speak, in terms of land acquisition. So the Metro Parks annual payment was $385,000, and that was for 15 years from 2002 to 2017 and totaled $5.7 million. That last payment occurred in 2017. Additionally, the Kaufman Park expansion had debt service payments from 2000 to 2020 totaling $3.1 million. The last payment on that expansion occurred last year, so that park expansion is now fully paid off. Additionally, because the fund balance has not been robust enough, if you will, to just purchase parkland outright, the general fund had previously transferred funds to the Parkland Acquisition Fund for totaling about $1.9 million for purchases predominantly of the riverfront properties when the Bridge Park area was in its pre-construction phases. The city was acquiring properties by the river and the land swaps and everything that occurred in the 14 and 15 timeframe. So the general fund funded those transfers to the Parkland Acquisition, and the Parkland Acquisition has been repaying those since that timeframe. Those advances were fully repaid in 2019. So you can see that beginning with 2021 and significantly even with 2020, the fund has been unencumbered by annual ongoing expenditures in a way that has not existed really in its history, dating back to the Metro Parks and Kaufman Park expansions in the early 2000s. So this is kind of a new opportunity to reevaluate, revisit, understand what we would like that fund to be. The other expenditures are predominantly county auditor deductions for collecting property taxes is really what that amounts to. So given that there are no current expenditures planned for the fund, of course, the CIPs have historically appropriated $750,000 annually for capital for parkland acquisition. I would expect that those would continue or potentially increase, but absent a parkland being identified for purchase, they would not. They would become unencumbered at the end of the year and expire, and the money would become part of the fund balance. But as I write here, there are no recurring annual expenditures for the fund. Annual revenues are totaling about $850,000. And in this environment, you will see the fund balance grow by that amount annually. So at the end of 2021, we're projecting a fund balance of about $2.8 million. I projected this out over the term of the next CIP from the 22-26 CIP, as I think is a good 5-year planning window. At the end of that 5-year planning window, we could potentially have a parkland acquisition fund balance of around $7 million. And I don't want to understate, I do, fully agree that future funding for parkland is necessary. I'm not articulating that I don't see the need for that at all. I want to be clear on that. I just want to make sure that we're examining this kind of recent development as all these kind of annual expenditures have now left the fund relatively recently, allowing its fund balance to grow over the term of the next CIP. So some policy considerations as we talk about the Fund 402 fund balance is what parkland purchases remain outstanding. And part of this is thinking about the city's park needs. I think we've identified areas of the city where we would use additional parkland. The other part of this, I think that is important, that is important to understand is generally parkland and parkland acquisition comes not only with a capital expenditure, which is what this fund clearly addresses, but also with an operating expenditure. Parkland needs to be mowed, it needs to be maintained. Even maybe some of the parkland down by the river might have some debris removal as inactive parkland that needs to be maintained. So there are operating expenditures associated with parkland purchases. The other part of that naturally comes to my mind is we are currently constructing the Riverside Crossing Park, and operations for that park will begin in 22 or 23. I don't know what the timeline is there, but we will have an operating budget impact for that fund that we have not yet, for that park rather, that we have not yet discussed and identified. With the kind of that conversation, what is the appropriate fund balance for the Parkland Acquisition Fund? So given the parkland assets that remain outstanding that we'd like to purchase, where would we like to see the fund balance? And this is kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, It's obviously nice to pay cash for parkland. It's nice to have parkland money in the parkland fund. Historically, as you can see from the Metro Parks and the Kaufman Park and the repayment of general fund advances, a lack of funding in the parkland fund has not prohibited the city from pursuing parkland when the city viewed it as a priority. So whether the parkland fund contains sufficient funding to wholly purchase a park or not, there are always ways to advance money from the general fund or the capital fund and then repay that through the parkland if that's a priority of council. Parkland fund is just one of the funding mechanisms that exist to pay for parkland. And I put on here if we reduce, but what I really should have said is if we change, because obviously you can increase the allocation as well. If we change the amount allocated to the parkland acquisition fund, what other priorities could be funded with that revenue? We have an opportunity here with about $850,000 to determine, what are our priorities with that funding, including parkland acquisition. And I think later in the millage discussion, I talk a little bit about land acquisition, bank, sewer and water, enhancements, stormwater, some of the things that we've been talking about that are capital needs for our community that we talked about in a little bit. So with that, I'll pause and allow you guys to ask any questions.
Can I ask you a question real quick, Matt? I think sometimes we set policy, we set priorities, we send messages, we kind of direct the city on the course it's going to take through our spending of money. That is how, and so I think when parkland acquisition was really, really important. I mean, that's one of the things that sets our neighborhoods apart. Every single neighborhood's got a park. So it was always really a really important policy and all those things, and it had its time and its place. Would there be a reason why, or tell me why we would not want to, in looping back to your first topic, the 401 land acquisition? I personally believe one of our greatest priorities moving forward, I don't think we would have the OSU hospital if we would not have purchased that land and been able to factor that into that development agreement. So I think that banking land is an enormous fight. That is an asset that we have that not many communities do. When you couple 270 and 33 and all that frontage and what's going on over on Emerald 8, the opportunity to bank land and factor that land then into economic development is a really powerful thing that sets us apart from other communities, the other communities that we'd be in competition with. Would there be a reason to not roll both 401 and 402 into one fund and just call it land acquisition and free up council's ability to decide why it is they're acquiring that land, whether it's economic or parkland or whatever? And is there a reason to maintain any more? Like you said, what other parks are we going to buy? What if we put all of that money into one fund and just labeled it land acquisition for council to spend as it sees fit as opportunities come up?
Philosophically, I don't think there's any reason not to do that. I'd have to check with the auditor as to whether or not we can create a special fund given the revenue sources are what they are. But philosophically, could we channel parkland revenue into that land acquisition line? I think that's kind of exactly the kind of policy discussion that I'm kind of bringing forward today, is that consideration. Kind of exactly that consideration.
I think there's a procedural issue there just due to resolution 4620, right?
Well, we'd have to start by allocating the millage differently, and
That's what I mean.
we'd have to work with the auditor to find out if we can set up a separate fund or if we just need to account for it within the capital improvements fund. The impact and idea would be the same. The accounting for it might be a little different, but the idea would be another $800,000 theoretically per year for land acquisition earmarked in that account, if you will.
So it might make sense, Matt, for us to go ahead and have the millage portion of this conversation
Sure.
alongside of this part of the conversation, so that we can sort of have that discussion about, should we be thinking about how we would roll this all into one overall land acquisition, versus having them separate, one land acquisition, one parkland acquisition. But I think you need to have the millage conversation along with it, so you've got the whole package, if you will.
Absolutely. So rolling into that millage discussion, So there is 1.75 mils of inside millage, also known as unvoted millage, that is distributed to the city of Dublin. That was last approved in resolution 46-20, if you're interested in further reading and details on that. The history of the distribution is on this slide. This distribution has been in place for the last 10 years. The 0.35 mils is distributed to the Parkland Acquisition Fund. 1.4 mils is distributed to the Capital Improvements Fund. And then you can see the other distributions over those time years. I think the important kind of distinction with this revenue source that's worth noting is that the millage remains constant. So the effective millage remains constant while the valuation of property increases. So this is unlike voted millage, where the effective millage is reduced every year so that the amount collected stays the same. So over the last 10 years, the distribution of the millage to the Parkland Acquisition Fund has remained the same. But because the city of Dublin's property values have increased substantially, frankly, in the last 10 years, the amount distributed to the Parkland Fund has increased by a similar amount. So these millages are unlike the millages that we're maybe more familiar with because they're inside millage. They're kind of treated very uniquely in terms of state law and their revenue distribution. So that 0.35 mils continues to grow, and it will continue to grow in the future as property values and the valuation of Dublin continues to grow. And you can see that it's a substantial amount in 1.75 mils. It means almost $4 million, which is a significant sum of funding. So the policy considerations with regard to this are, as discussed during the Parkland acquisition, do nothing. You can see that the Parkland Fund balance will continue to grow in that environment. Reduce the allocation. What is inappropriate? What is the fund balance you're seeking? Do you get to the fund balance and stop? Do you slowly approach the fund balance? Do you go slightly over the fund balance? All those kind of details. And the only thing I would point out there is these funds are part of a 5-year planning process, and 5-year planning processes do not do well in fits and starts. A consistent, slow, rolling treatment is much more manageable than a funding stream that delivers $500,000 in 1 year, zero in the next, 250,000 in the next. Is kind of a more difficult funding stream to balance over a 5-year CIP. When should the reduction occur? If there's a reduction, when a fund balance target is met or as it's met. What remains outstanding? We've talked about the riverfront area, but are there other areas? Should the millage be returned to the CIP fund for use in the CIP and just general CIP needs as far as the competing priorities of that? Or should it be targeted to a specific area? And some that I've identified that we've talked about here are land acquisition. And I would not necessarily discourage future parkland acquisition from being part of that conversation. We've talked about stormwater improvements earlier today. The kind of nice part about this is it is a property-based tax that covers the whole city. So it's very similar to the special improvement districts and some of the other things that we might be talking about, in that it's not income tax revenue and it is citywide and it already exists administratively. So there's some things to potentially consider there. And then we know we have some funding needs for our sewer and water extensions that the general fund is currently funding. If you wanted to reduce the general fund's contribution and increase the CIP fund's contribution, this would be a potential revenue source that could free up those dollars. Those certainly aren't the only priorities or maybe even the correct priorities. Those are just some I know we've discussed in the last 6 months at the council level. So I put them on here as potential policy considerations. And with that, I'm available for any other additional questions.
So getting into this meeting, I had some competing thoughts or issues. On the one hand, the pace at which the Parkland Acquisition Fund is growing, when you look at that $7 million number, you might think, gosh, that's more than we would ever need. But that's, in reality, there are at least 2 different properties around the city that would cost us around $5 million. And we wouldn't reach that number until 2024 at the current pace. So that then indicates we kind of let everything ride the way it is. But when Greg said what he said, his suggestion of more or less merging the two, that solves to me all the problems. If it's possible to do it, you leave the millage alone, you leave the allocations alone, you just make it one big pot, and then from year to year we can decide what we want to use that money for. So I am all for investigating the potential of merging those two funds into one. I think that solves a lot of the other issues that you've presented here.
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting concept that I think is worth exploring to see if that's possible. Because I think, I would like to see what I'd like to see is I'd like to get a better understanding of how much potential parkland is out there for us to acquire. What would be that total dollar amount? I mean, we're not going to go out tomorrow and even if we had all whatever, let's say it's $7 million or $8 million, whatever that might be. We're not going to go out there and purchase it tomorrow, right? Because then it presents you other problems, right? You've got to figure out how are you going to pay to have it constructed. How are you going to pay to have it programmed? You've got people who need to work there and maintain the parks. There's a whole lot of overhead and things that come with that, right? And so you're not going to go out and buy it all tomorrow and just let it sit there either. So I think using a very sort of planful approach on what is the goal that we want to get to and taking some steps in between to figure out how to get us there, whether we have two funds or whether we have one fund, is interesting. I think the only problem that I have with merging the two into one is knowing, because I don't think we can ever know in terms of land acquisition, general land acquisition, especially for economic development purposes, what potentially is out there. I think it's a little easier for us to narrow down what potential parkland is out there. So it's a little easier for us to plan to, what is the appropriate number over what appropriate period of time to get us to that parkland acquisition nirvana. I think it's much more difficult to get us to what do we think is that land acquisition number that makes sense over a period of time. That would be my biggest concern with merging the two. I definitely hear what you guys are saying. I think there's a level of flexibility in there that having them merge together might bring to us. But the notions of what they mean are also very different. And that's the part that would just concern me a little bit there. Not that I'm opposed to, researching it and hearing what Matt comes back with. I think that's a pretty interesting concept. And maybe depending on what Matt comes back with, this may end up for me in my mind anyway, being probably at more of a council work session conversation, because it is a broader policy discussion. I think we can come together as a finance committee and make some recommendations on what we want to bring to council, but it's going to take council, all of us together to really make a decision. Not that I'm trying to kick the can, that's not it at all. I'm very fine in giving staff some direction to go hunt and peck down a few things. I don't know, reactions to that?
I would just say, of course, parkland costs us money and land acquisition makes us money, in the grand scheme of things.
That's true.
One of the things that Matt sort of, I took it as sort of a hint, and that is that we need to be careful about how much parkland we acquire, because we need to think long-term about the operating expenses associated with that. So I would not necessarily say that there's a ceiling, but I mean, there is a ceiling. The ceiling can be adjusted as the city grows and we have more revenue to cover that. But I guess if I had to make a decision tonight, I would say I don't want to give up the millage between the two funds. So if you asked, well, if you were to reduce the allocation to the parkland fund, what would you do with it? I'd put it in land acquisition. So by merging the two, by default, it kind of goes that direction anyway. I agree, Christina. I think it is definitely a policy shift because we sort of have guardrails now
Yeah.
because the two are separated, and we're somewhat removing those guardrails. It's making it a little more complicated because we're removing restrictions. But so my two cents.
No, I appreciate that. Greg, what are your thoughts?
If Matt can figure out whether it impacts the village, I'm not a stupid person. I've never understood millage, and I have tried to understand it for probably 30 years, and I never have understood it, so I've given up. I have no interest in understanding it because I have no ability to, but you do. So as long as you guys understand all that stuff, that is good for me. I think from a policy perspective, if we can maintain the flow of funds and it doesn't impact that, I think we have established ourselves in our community as committed to green space and parks and all of that stuff. That is a reputation that we clearly have. The thing that land banking does is it allows us not only to incentivize the kinds of economic partners that we want, but it also gives us the ability to put them where we want them to be. And Ohio State is right exactly where we wanted it to be, and that is the reason why it happened, and it was perfect for everybody because it gives us that extra punch in the economic in the development agreements that some of the other communities around here don't have, and it gives our staff so much control. If it's possible, I'm comfortable with council having the flexibility to just use it as a fund as land banking, but whether that's possible or not, Matt, is something for you guys much smarter than I to understand. I do just want to point out, and it occurs to me quite often serving on this council, and it is because of generations of hard work, stretching all the way back to Marcia, and then Marcia being the city manager, and all those council people that came before us. Really hard work that puts us in a position to even have these possible solutions and discussions available to us. The financial health of this community can weather, and that was one of the things I said in my little video I went over there and made, is that we weathered 2008, and we have now weathered COVID, for crying out loud, and we have this staff and this council has done it seemingly almost without breaking a sweat. It is absorbing the punches and the gut blows and all of these things that happen. And the reason why we're able to is because of solid, conservative financial planning that took place years ago that even put us in this position. I do believe we as a community are evolving to the point where land banking for economic development is, the green space thing and the parks, that's well under control. That's the next frontier, is making sure we keep our tax revenue and our tax generating entities here and happy and where we want them to be. So however you guys can figure all that out, I'm good with that.
Thanks, Greg. And I appreciate that. And I think that, I think we all agree that, it is previous councils and staff and all the people that have worked together that have gotten us to be able to have this conversation, for sure. No doubt about it. Again, I think we send Matt back, have him do a little bit of research so that we can sort of have the full picture in front of us as we have this discussion. I still have concerns about merging the two, just because we kind of actually alluded to this a little bit earlier when we had the conversation about the maintaining of stormwater basins. In HOAs over time, they forget or they lose sight of what was put together for them, what decision was made. My concern would be that as we move forward, and there are different councils and staff, that if we have everything put together, that we eventually lose what the meaning of the Parkland Acquisition Fund was for in the first place. That's my only concern. Now, if we can write that and put that in a way that solves that problem, I could definitely be swayed, but that would be my concern. So I think, Matt, our direction, and please, Greg and Andy, hop in if I'm speaking, beyond what you think is the right thing to do, but would be to go back, do a little bit of research on the millage question, and see what those possibilities even are. And then I think, if you can maybe, talk with Dana and figure out what are the potential parkland acquisitions that we've talked about. I know we've talked about, North Riverview. I know we've talked about along the river, all the way up to Scioto Park and in and along by the Arts Council. If we can sort of get an idea of what that is and what the potential costs would be for those, that might also help us, round out that conversation. And I think at this point, we could bring it back to this group. And then I think the three of us can make a decision, Greg and Andy, at that point, what are our options that we want to bring in front of council? Because we do have to have this conversation in front of all of council. Does that make sense? Are you guys okay with that approach?
Yes.
Sweet. Matt, do you have enough direction?
I believe I do. I appreciate the conversation, and I couldn't agree more, Greg, with your comments. Sometimes I look back and say to myself, it only took 3 generations to get us here. Don't mess it up.
Oh, no pressure, right?
Right. So I completely agree with that, and I'll take these questions back and bring you back something actionable or discussion worthy.
Excellent. Did we make it all the way through the agenda?
Quick.
Wow. Okay, one final thing, and I think Jenny's gonna do this for us, is she's gonna get out some potential times to go with dates so we can get these suckers on this schedule so that Matt knows what dates he has to work to get us all of our answers. So awesome. Thank you, Jenny, for that. I really appreciate it. Greg, Andy, do you have anything else for the good of the order? Jenny, do you need anything from us, Jenny? Procedurally, we're good?
I think you're good.
Excellent. Matt, please pass along our thanks again to your colleagues as well. We really appreciate all the hard work that you guys have put together, and as well with the work that CSAC has put together. I know we were kind of sending you back to do a little more research, but we really, really appreciate the time and the effort. It certainly means a lot to us and helps us make decisions. So thank you.
Sure, I'll pass that along. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, folks. Well, if that's all, then we will stand adjourned.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good meeting. Well done.